All right, we are live. This is Ed Fletcher, and this is EverForward, my new internet streaming show. We are live on Facebook. We're streaming on Periscope, and we will air on Access Sacramento, Sacramento's communication channel as well. I'm a long-time Sacramento reporter and recently started this show and doing videos about the Justice for George Floyd protests, the Black Lives Matter movement, but it remains to be seen where the show will evolve. But we're excited to have a excellent guest today to help us really discuss some of the law enforcement issues that have been happening in the community as a result of the Justice for George Floyd protest, Black Lives Matter movement, and this notion of defunding the police. So if you're in Sacramento, there's probably no better expert to talk to than Sheriff John McGinness. So we're going to bring him on, and we're going to talk about these issues and where we go as a community from him. From here. All right. So with no further ado, adding him to the stream here. Welcome to the show, John. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Ed. Good to be with you. I have to warn you, I'm having a little bit of difficulty hearing you, but I'll do my best. So bear with me if I talk too loud. It's because you're very soft or something. I'm going to try headphones and see if that helps.
Okay, we lost your picture as well. So we had that in here. Maybe it's back. I see it in the preview stream, but not on the main stream.
Okay, and the good news is I can now hear you. So.
Okay, well, that's good. John, why don't you, for those who don't know you, please introduce yourself and let them know your credentials.
Sure. I retired after 31 years in the Sheriff's Department, serving in a number of assignments over the years. Towards the end of my career, the last 4 years, I was the elected sheriff. I actually retired nearly 10 years ago, and since that time have been an adjunct professor of criminal justice and host of the John McGinness Show on KFTK. So, and actually also a consultant on law enforcement matters. So very much involved in what's going on and very interested in the developments, especially the last month or so.
Okay. So again, I appreciate you being on. Let me check. We got some comments here. Let me ask some, I guess, sort of grounding questions so that maybe we're all on the same page here. And then I want to talk about the current events here. In your opinion, do law enforcement officers ever lie?
Well, of course, human beings lie. Law enforcement officers are human beings. I will tell you that it is a very good way for a person to end their career. A person who is known to lie and can be proven to have lied will forfeit their career in law enforcement. And in fact, in a good background investigation, among the things that are looked for are a person's propensity to tell the truth versus not. And the reason for that is very basic, that you're talking about a person who, upon appointment as a peace officer, can make an arrest and actually deprive somebody of their liberty and their mobility just based upon probable cause and their ability to articulate their observations. So if you're going to testify in court in a matter that can actually lock a person up for life, or in some cases take their life, the need for that person to be have a reputation of veracity and honesty is incredibly important. So yes, of course, the potential exists, but it's certainly not tolerated. I can tell you very candidly, I fired a number of people from the ranks of law enforcement for a violation of what was known internally as a violation of General Order 3/00, professional responsibility, fair to tell the truth.
Okay, all right. I appreciate that answer. Would you agree that there are bad cops?
Of course, they're bad human beings. I think we've all had a chance to see a graphic illustration of a bad cop, if you will, bad human being, in Minneapolis back on Memorial Day. Okay.
So why is it so difficult historically, and I guess it's my perspective, difficult for law enforcement to throw out the bad apples and to eliminate people that are bad cops or bad deputies, bad at law enforcement?
Well, it's there are a number of factors. Obviously, there's organized labor contracts that protect public employees. There is a need to be able to present sufficient evidence to show cause for termination when a person is to be fired. But I'll tell you very candidly, it's not outside the realm of possibility. In fact, I can tell you we had a number of significant cases in which we established that a member of our organization had breached the expectations, their contract, their portion of the contract in terms of their performance. Oftentimes, a very common cause for dismissal is dishonesty. And when that happens, and it can be proven, because of the critical need for a law enforcement officer to be unimpeachable on the stand as a witness, everything from a parking violation up to and including capital crimes, it's very important. So the same thing's true in other cases in which they deviate from acceptable behavior. I will tell you candidly, there were swings and misses we had where we tried to get rid of somebody. They took the matter to court and they prevailed. We had to reinstate them. But the vast majority, the overwhelming majority, in fact, for a substantial period of time now, looking back, those termination cases have stood. Another interesting observation, if I may, there was a period of time, I don't know if it's true today, but period of time in which 98% of our excessive force complaints were internally generated. So only 2% of the complaints for excessive force were coming from outside the organization. And I think that's a little bit of a surprise for people who just rely upon news to get their information as to how law enforcement practices are executed.
Okay. Would you say that the system for weeding out bad apples is working?
It's not perfect, but I think there are good faith efforts to do the right thing. And just as in other cases where you have due process, you have
good faith efforts.
Good
faith efforts and actually working are two different things.
You're absolutely correct. It's not perfect, and I will never assert that it is. But I think on balance, the right thing is done. Certainly in my experience.
Okay. Well, I think a lot of people would disagree with you on that point. What would you say what have you been hearing as a law enforcement expert? These, I guess, sort of escalating or persistent protests with the Black Lives Matter movement, from Tamir Rice to Trayvon Martin to Stephon Clark. What are you hearing as a law enforcement person about the operation of law enforcement in America?
Well, just to not every one of those cases involved a peace officer, by the way, just to clarify. Trayvon Martin was not killed by a law enforcement officer. It was
sure, correct.
Frankly, I think a kind of a wannabe who who couldn't qualify to be appointed as a peace officer. But I think those cases, looking at a number I've heard, and I don't know the veracity of the number, but I've heard 10 million arrests are made nationally every year. So if you look at the context of 10 million arrests being made at the relatively small number of cases in which significant force, certainly deadly force, is used, if there's one that's improper, that's too many. There's no doubt about that. But the relative rarity of that occurrence, I think, is something that's lost with all of that's taken place in recent weeks and months. And the perception, I believe, on the part of many is that law enforcement officers kill young black men every day, and that certainly is far from the truth. And each of those cases that you referenced represent a different set of circumstances. You mentioned Stephon Clark, and we all had an opportunity to hear the district attorney's explanation as to what took place in that particular case, and I reached a conclusion based upon that evidence that the officers in that case acted in a belief that Mr. Clark posed an imminent threat to their safety. In fact, some things about their behavior immediately, spontaneously uttered after the shots were fired when they inquired as to each other and their well-being. Had they been shot because they believed that Mr. Clark had a gun, and in fact, I think they believed at that time that he had fired it. So that is a completely different set of circumstances from Tamir Rice, or certainly from George Floyd. So each of these taken on their own, I think, tell a substantially different story.
Okay. Would you agree with the argument that if you looked at the overall law enforcement outcomes for African Americans that the criminal justice system isn't working for African Americans, that we're doing something wrong?
I don't know that I could reach that conclusion. There's certainly disproportionate encounters with African American men in the law enforcement profession, the law enforcement community. But I think if you look at the role that poverty plays in inner cities across the country, and desperation born out of poverty, and frankly the lack of opportunity that's afforded people who are living in poverty-stricken communities, the potential for the propensity for people in those conditions to become involved in the criminal justice system is very real. And there are some predictors along the line, I think, that influence how people's lives may go. And it's regrettable. It's horrible. I'd love to look at this really holistically and find out why those trends happen outside of, but beyond, I should say, beyond, but including cases of law enforcement use of force, to try to create some level of equity across the board. And I think that's a very legitimate and worthwhile effort.
Well, I mean, sir, you seem to be, in some part, making the case for the defund the police effort. I think the crux of that argument is that during the 90s and 2000s, as crime went up, we poured more cops on the situation, but decreased funding for mental health, for housing, for education. And in the absence of opportunity, crime runs rampant. And just having more cops and more jails hasn't been a solution. What would you say to that argument about that?
Well, the incidence of criminal conduct actually decreased after some very significant strides were made to fund law enforcement agencies. In fact, to provide federal dollars to local law enforcement agencies to bring up the staffing levels. But it doesn't mean that other efforts should not be made to provide equilibrium and in addition, greater access to people living in poverty-stricken communities. I think in large part you can take the disparity of race and replace that with poverty, and that's probably a more likely predictor in terms of the likelihood, the extent to which people will be able to enjoy the American dream. If they don't have access, if they don't have the benefit of being tutored and cared for and really guided into an area that will serve their purposes well, human beings, I think, are more likely to suffer, more likely to become involved in criminal conduct. I don't know of a law enforcement agency anywhere that is adequately funded. I don't think anybody believes they have enough funds or resources to meet their mission to respond to emergency calls for service even. Now, are there other efforts that should be undertaken as well outside the scope or the realm of public safety? Absolutely true. 100% agree with that. Education, I think, is absolutely critical.
Where do we go from here if you're trying to make the argument that we need more money for cops, but we need more money for these other things? It seems like we can't create money out of nowhere. So the Black Lives Matter argument is, let's take some of that from the police and let's give it to other things, so you don't have to answer calls for homelessness, calls for mental health, calls for services that don't require a gun and a badge.
Which are two different arguments, I would say. And frankly, to the one, I say yes. The homelessness is a classic example because of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals opinion and the Supreme Court's course of action, which they refused to hear the matter. The geographical jurisdictions within the Ninth Circuit cannot bring law enforcement consequences to bear on people who are camping in public places, notwithstanding the fact that it qualifies as a trespass violation. So when you take that potential resolution out of the equation, it's not a law enforcement problem. So if there's an opportunity to bring counselors, crisis managers, others into that equation to try to help people out of that lifestyle, I think that's absolutely appropriate because it's not a law enforcement problem. Other cases I've heard referenced have been domestic violence activity. Well, that's one of the more dangerous encounters a law enforcement officer will have. So the idea of putting social workers as first responders to a domestic violence call, where one of the descriptors of the event itself is violence, I think is perhaps short-sighted and create a compromised environment of safety. But just to clarify, not that I would say that law enforcement agencies don't need more funding, but I haven't argued for more funding. I'm simply saying if you take funds away from that public safety effort without making changes in terms of the expectations, I think the ability to keep communities safe is going to be compromised. Look at the city of Chicago a couple of weekends back when I forgot, I think it's 82 people were shot in one single weekend. And they're waiting for a law enforcement response, and none was forthcoming because there were none available. They're all tied up with demonstrations, rioting, and looting. So they got a little bit of an example of what you see when you have carnage on the streets of the south and west side of Chicago in particular, and there's nobody to come to respond to deal with it. I think the foreseeability of crisis there is very, very real.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much they're dealing with it in Chicago anyway, or what the closure rate is, and the fact that nobody trusts law enforcement there isn't helping the problem, because there's that climate of don't be snitches. They have a very hard time doing the service that they're supposed to do, and until you change that climate, it seems like it's a hard road to hold when law enforcement seems like it's outside of the community and not of the community.
I don't disagree with that. And a lot of strides were made back in the 90s with federal dollars that did come to local jurisdictions for community-oriented policing strategies. And it drove crime rates down. It enhanced the relationships between and among law enforcement officers in the community. I was a part of that and had the benefit of federal dollars that came our way in the Clinton administration. It really, truly helped, I think, very effectively police communities. And we saw the numbers plummet. So I have a belief in that and the benefit of that.
Everybody seems to be for community policing, except for police agencies that have to pay for it.
I don't think that's true. I mean, I was a strong supporter
well, then why
of community-oriented policing.
Why aren't they doing it now? Why isn't Scott Jones doing it now? Why don't they require people to live in the areas that they police? They all live in gated communities in Rockland and think of the ghetto.
Yeah, the simple answer to that is you cannot. You cannot compel people to live in a certain area or make a job offer, a job option dependent upon residency. The city of Sacramento offered an enhancement. I think it was $5,000. I'm not sure about that. I'm reasonably sure it was $5,000 for city police officers who moved back into the city. I don't know that anybody took advantage of it, but they tried. They made a good faith effort. But there's also the reality of living and working in different areas and being able to flip the switch off and not constantly be on the job 24/7 if you lived in that community where you work. So there are advantages and disadvantages either way, I believe. I've worked in the area where I lived, and I've lived outside the area where I worked both, and I could see advantages to either or.
Yeah, I feel like there's this greater disconnect between people who they're policing an area versus areas that they live in, and I think that just that disconnect between the policed and the police is just growing too great. Yeah. You mentioned Darrell Steinberg and some of the efforts there, and
I never mentioned Darrell Steinberg.
Oh, did you say the Sacramento Police? No.
Sacramento Police, the city of Sacramento offered a financial incentive for officers to move back into the city. I think it was actually before Steinberg's time, but I'm not sure about that.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to talk about the Steinberg proposal and I guess previous efforts to police the police. I guess it was the late 90s, Sacramento got started on an effort and created a Office of Police Accountability, and now it's a Office of Public Safety Accountability, and the county has a what do they call it, a Inspector General. Yeah. Darrell Steinberg is proposing creating a is he going to call it an Inspector General? that would oversee, or not oversee, but be able to investigate law enforcement incidents. What do you think about these efforts to create an outside body to look at these incidents, as opposed to internal affairs being the arbiter of good shoot, bad shoot?
Remember, it's not internal affairs that is the arbiter. It's the internal affairs investigators that do a portion of that investigation, but it's also subject to an investigation by the district attorney's office, the potential for the grand jury to look at it, the attorney general, the FBI and the U.S. attorney's office, and an entity with which you're greatly familiar, the media. So the potential for the reality of scrutiny is I think, very, very real and profound. A lot of these efforts along the lines of Office of Accountability, Inspector General, I think, quite frankly, are stood up in large part to frankly appease to some degree. And in terms of the substance, the resources exist right now to substantively look at the merits of law enforcement conduct and take action, up to and including prosecution when officers misbehave. There have been members of law enforcement organizations in the county of Sacramento that have been prosecuted by the district attorney in recent years. So it's not an outlier. It's not beyond the realm of possibility, certainly. But remember, the standard, the bar for meeting the elements of criminal conduct is pretty high. You talk about things that we all see, that somebody does, and people are outraged and appalled by what they see, but that is not the standard to convict somebody of criminal conduct. They've got to meet the objective standard. They have to show the state of mind. They've got to show malice aforethought if you're talking about the taking of a life. And if that's not there, you simply don't have it. It's not just that Ed Fletcher or John McGinness are revolted by something they see. It's got to be those statutes, the elements, I should say, of the statutes have to be met in order for criminal prosecution to take place. Terminating employees is a lower bar, and that happens. And again, I just want to reiterate, I know it's still true today. I don't know that it's 98%, but the vast majority excessive force complaints in the Sacramento Sheriff's Department are internally generated, not even by the victim, if you will, of that excessive force, but by the officers, the colleagues who witnessed that. And that's, I think that's something that surprises the public when they hear it. But the numbers are very, very, very real. And
does that impact somebody's career?
Oh God, yes, it can bring about an end to that career very quickly. And of course, there are cases over the years that the public never knew about because it was an administrative matter, personnel matter, and the person's fired, they're gone forever, and they're not coming back. But it doesn't rise to the level of criminal prosecution. I also took cases to the DA. I personally did.
So why wouldn't you publicize this?
Well, until recently, you could not. It was prohibited. You could not publish the details of the police officer misconduct case under the Peace Officers Bill of Rights. It was protected. It was privileged. In fact, I'm not 100% sure because I don't have to deal with that today. But I don't know the specifics as to which ones are publishable and which ones are not. But around a dozen people a year would involuntarily end their career. And that was not unusual. And it was because they failed to meet the terms of their obligations.
Okay, I think,
I got to tell you, in my time in patrol, I had the privilege of working around a lot of great people, and the idea of race being a motivator for law enforcement contact or any treatment of somebody, I never ever saw it. I worked with black partners, and thoroughly enjoyed that, and became very, very good friends on and off the job, and worked the community together. And the manner in which a person behaves, how they comport themselves, those are things that people reasonably look at. But skin pigment, absolutely never, ever, ever, ever a factor. And I sense that I'm not believed by many when I say that. I have no reason to lie about it, and I don't see, especially members of the younger generation, being inclined to process things that way. It may be surprising for people outside to know about the number of interracial marriages in law enforcement agencies, for example. It's not a rarity. And it's just I don't think people think skin pigment when they think of a certain kind of behavior. It's just
I've
not
been on
part of the thing.
ride-alongs where it's like, okay, let's go to the hood, let's drive around, let's pick out a car that looks like a quote unquote suspect car, and let's light them up, pull them over, and let's ask them if they're on parole. Oh, you're on parole. Please step out of the car. Can I search you? Okay, yeah. And there wasn't really a reason for it. It wasn't officially a stop and frisk, but it's like, let's put some heat on this neighborhood here. And because I know that there's lots of parolees here, and it was kind of a fishing expedition. And I don't think that they did it because they were black, but it was a quote unquote high crime area that happened to have a lot of black people. But the end result was black people that were living in fear and distrust and not feeling like law enforcement is it's something that is done to them, not for them.
Well, I think that same experience would be shared by people who grew up in Rio Linda, white people who grew up in Rio Linda, and they say it's an area where there's some crime, and law enforcement officers in Rio Linda will go out looking for things like expired registration, mechanical equipment violations on a car, unsafe, improper driving. They make a stop based on that, and from that point, conversations are engaged in, questions are asked. And as a person who lives in a community that wants it to be crime free and safe, I appreciate that. If you go out trying to make a community safe and you just sit back and wait for a felony to be reported, you're going to be totally ineffective. If you go out looking for lawful reasons to talk to people, and not everybody needs a citation, not everybody needs to be arrested, but talk to them, let them know you're there. I think that's frankly community-oriented policing. Now, picking on somebody because of their race or anything else that's not conduct that's prohibited by law is another story. It should not be tolerated, and in fact, it violates the law. So, in your own explanation, you say they're not looking for people based on race, but rather overall behavior and the prevailing criminal activity in a given area.
Right, but if you went to the white skate park as often as you went to the ghetto, you'd find some white kids with weed. And then suddenly they would be on parole. And then next time you went, they could be subject to search.
You think that doesn't happen?
I think that white people can commit crimes like that with more impunity than black people. I talk to white friends that can get out of a ticket, whereas black people feel like they don't get the benefit of the doubt. Black people talk about the fear that goes with being pulled over, whereas white people, that's a different level of like fear or scared or I don't know. I've never been white, so I don't know what kind of rights I get.
And I've never been black, but I have been stopped. I have been stopped by the police.
I've never had white woman rights either. That would be something if I could just turn on my white woman tears and get out of tickets.
Yeah.
Or feel like that my life is not at risk with this law enforcement encounter.
Yeah, and all I can tell you is in all my years in the field, not just from my perspective of the people with whom I worked, again, several of them were black and good people, very, very good people. I just didn't see that. I never saw anybody make an enforcement decision based upon race. Other factors, yeah. Something that can start out as a verbal warning and then a bad attitude ensues and there's evidence that the person doesn't get the message, yeah, then a citation would follow. Some people, I try to kind of commit to the idea that before I made contact, I was going to make my decision as to whether or not it was going to be a citation or a verbal warning, and I stayed with that. But I understand not everybody did. And one of the justifications, if you intend to warn somebody to change their behavior and you think that's going to work, then that warning's sufficient. If not, then perhaps you have to ratchet it up. But again, my personal goal was, my commitment to myself, not to anybody else, was that before I had a conversation with them, I'd make my decision. as to whether it was going to be a verbal warning or a citation. And I think a lot of people followed that same standard. And I've been stopped. I was a young guy that didn't look like an old gray-haired guy that wears a business suit, and I got scrutinized. I got scrutinized a lot. My son was the very first day he went out on his own in a car, 16 years of age, just went from permit to driver's license. The very first minutes that he was driving a car illegally on the streets in the state of California, he got stopped by the police because he had a burnout brake light. Well, guess what came of that contact? He and that officer that stopped him are good friends to this day, and that was at least 15 years ago. So he was stopped. He was a young guy driving a car in an area in the middle of the day, and that caught the attention. I don't think the brake light was really truly the issue, but it was the legal cause to make the stop, find out what this kid's doing, and they were satisfied with one another. They struck up a friendship, and they're friends to this day. So not every contact has to be bad. And unfortunately, I think a lot of what has come out in recent years, the suggestion is made that if you're a young black man, you're going to be mistreated if you're stopped by the police. Well, I know that to not be the case. I know that from my personal experience. We can have a very, very, very friendly encounter, and we can part.
Let's go to the Rayshad Brooks case. It seemed like a very friendly encounter, and it seemed like Rayshad is trying to not incriminate himself, talk his way out of a DUI. And the first cop seemed somewhat sympathetic. And then the second person gets there and wants to go straight to the breathalyzer. And I guess I'm wondering, of course, Rayshad should not grab the taser, should not resist.
Should not punch the officer.
Should not punch the officer, should not shoot a taser at the officer. But is there an argument to be made
and by the way,
they should have let Rayshad go, or should have let somebody pick Rayshad up? Once he said, "Yeah, I can get somebody to pick me up," give him an Uber.
I have a personal bias on this one. I do have a bias because I had a relative killed by a drunk driver, so I'm not sympathetic to impaired drivers. I frankly don't like them at all. I don't like that behavior at all, and so I think everybody who drives impaired should be taken forthwith. And guess what? The law says the same thing. So drunk drivers kill 10,000 people a year on our nation's highways. It's not a minor offense. So I heard the mayor of Atlanta say, why not just let them go? You don't let drunk drivers go. And I think organizations like MAD should speak out on that. That is really, truly dangerous activity. So they're duty bound to deal with that. And that's an obligation that I always took seriously, and I want others to take seriously. I drive on these roads. You drive on these roads. Our families drive on these roads. And I don't think drunk driving should be the subject of a blind eye. So perhaps I have some bias there.
I don't think we haven't conclusively proven that he had driven or that he had broke the law at that point.
Well,
and there was an option to allow him to not go to jail that night, but they chose to try to enforce an arrest, and it went bad. And I'm just trying to look at options of where
passed out behind the wheel of his car in a drive-up window. That's driving. He is a party in control of that car. He meets the elements of impaired driving, absolutely, positively. Again, a behavior that kills 10,000 people a year. That's not minor misconduct. I want the police. I want the police that patrol my neighborhood. I want the police to patrol the streets and highways where I drive to enforce the vehicle code and to be very, very committed to taking impaired drivers off the street. So we may have to agree to disagree on that. But I think the expectation is it's a mandatory booking. It's a mandatory booking under California law. There's no option on it. So it was not an option to let him go. If it were California, I don't know what Georgia's law says on that. But then if you just throw out the question, if you posit the question to a reasonable person and say, what happens if somebody punches a police officer? They present the objective symptoms of alcohol intoxication. They're driving a car. They punch a police officer who's attempting to arrest them, steal their taser, fire that taser at them while they're running. What's likely to happen to them? I think many people would suspect that would be a high-risk kind of behavior that could result in their demise. I'm not saying it.
Can you shoot them in the back?
You certainly can. I'm not saying it was necessarily the best course of action to take. Well, there's a couple. Look at Georgia law on it, and I don't know. A lot of people are very critical of this case, and some are very defensive of it, not having read Georgia law. So look at the occasions where law enforcement officers in the state of Georgia may use deadly force. And then look at a case known as Tennessee versus Gardner. that says if a person is engaged in violent behavior and fleeing the scene, deadly force can be used. Had he been involved in violent behavior? Is there a predictability of greater violence to follow? Those are the questions. So I don't have an end conclusion on the propriety of this, but I'm not one to jump to a conclusion and say yes, it was criminal on the part of the officers that fired, and the DA hasn't done that either in Fulton County. So, but I think there are a lot of factors to consider. It's not a crystal clear case. It's worthy of investigation and maybe litigation, but it's not. I don't reach a conclusion on it.
Well, which brings us to this question of qualified immunity.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that officers deserve qualified immunity? What do you think about the Democratic proposal to reform law enforcement?
I have never officially been a recruiter, but I have recruited a lot of people to law enforcement careers over the years because I think I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I think it's a worthwhile profession. I think you really truly have the potential, although it's gotten increasingly difficult, to make a positive influence on people's lives, save lives, do incredibly wonderful things. But my advice to anybody who's considering a law enforcement career, if qualified immunity goes by the wayside, don't do it. You find something else to do because you just can't. If you're working in compliance with department policies and statutory law, and a bad outcome takes place, you're going to be on the hook for that. So you would have the ranks of law enforcement agencies everywhere, frankly, would be fools if they would even consider working in that environment. I don't think that's going to go anywhere, but if it does, I think you will see the doors open, and anybody with sufficient intellect to be able to function effectively will leave.
And for those of you who are kind of new to the subject, basically qualified immunity means that if you follow the book and you resulted in a negative outcome, you can't be sued civilly for something you did by policy. Right. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. Okay. Yeah. So the potential for things to go desperately wrong is always the case, right? Right.
I think it's an interesting debate, and I heard somebody sort of put this other kind of proposal out about them having to get their own insurance so that if they tend to have bad outcomes as a law enforcement officer, they would become uninsurable and let the free market sort of take some of the situation out of the equation.
Yeah, it's a chance I wouldn't be willing to take.
Do we need no-knock warrants? Again, no-knock warrants is the ability to, I guess, have a warrant that you don't have to knock the door. You can just kick it down and go in.
Well, yeah. If you have somebody who is a person that has shown through their behavior that they're bent on killing people, and they are in a fortified home with tremendous firepower, and knocking on that door would be a suicide mission, I think it speaks for itself. There was a case not too many years ago up in Mendocino County. I don't know if you recall this, but there was a guy out there, survivalist in the wilderness, who had a rifle that was always in his possession. I believe he killed a member of the city council from Fort Bragg, I think it was, somewhere up in Mendocino County. He had killed a couple of people. The Alameda County Sheriff's Department actually went in to assist way up there in Mendocino County. He shot at them. He always had that gun at the ready. So based upon his conduct, that would be an example, I think. This was one in which members of the Sacramento Sheriff's Department actually went up there in a mutual aid request. They spotted the guy and they killed him and he had sealed his fate by virtue of his past behavior. And again, that goes back to that court decision, Tennessee versus Garner. They were acting lawfully when they did that. So if a person like that is hunkered down, sheltered, you simply cannot knock on that door and say, we're here to serve a warrant and take you to jail for the rest of your life for the crimes you've committed, because the outcome of that is very foreseeable. Should there be greater scrutiny, perhaps, in the issuance of no-knock warrants? Perhaps. I mean, I think that's a legitimate question. But there are some cases, if somebody's a terrorist and they're on a rampage and they've killed people, some of these people that have shot up schools and shopping malls and churches and synagogues, if they go hunker down someplace, I would hate to see somebody provide them with sufficient notice of an imminent threat to the offenders' freedom and liberty and life, to give them sufficient time to prepare by killing the person who's coming to bring justice.
Yeah, and the reason this is part of the conversation now is the Breonna Taylor
Right.
case, where she is a Louisville, Kentucky woman, actually works for the government. They have the wrong house,
Right.
execute a no-knock warrant. Her boyfriend gets out of bed and tries to stand his ground, and they're both gunned down.
Right. Yeah, obviously,
So, but you would agree that that needs to be used in more limited cases?
yeah, and I don't know, unfortunately, I don't know what the nature of the warrant was. In other words, the intended subject of that warrant, what their behavior had been. So I don't know that that no-knock warrant was necessarily improper, but there's also a tremendous burden that comes with executing those warrants. You have to get the right house. You have to exercise due diligence to make sure you're where you're supposed to be. So to throw out the use of no-knock warrants, because in this case some horrible mistakes were made, I think is perhaps looking at the wrong place for correction.
Okay. Now, finally, we've got the president issuing an executive order, and I think that if this were a month ago and in a vacuum, people would have been, I guess, shocked that it went this far. But strange times.
Yeah.
He signs an executive order banning the chokehold except for when the officer's life is in danger.
Yeah, and I don't know what a
creates
chokehold is. The term chokehold doesn't exist in any law enforcement force application regulations that I'm aware of. There's something called the carotid constriction, which is specifically not a chokehold.
Okay.
And this is not the carotid constriction is an area in which extensive training is applied for recruits in the academy, and ongoing training to make sure that the technique is understood and used properly. It is when the subject's head and therefore neck are pulled into a position. The neck is actually placed between the bicep and forearm of the applying officer, and then sufficient pressure is applied to constrict the flow of oxygenated blood to the brain for a period of time, rendering that person unconscious. It does not obstruct the airway, causing choking. That's not how it's supposed to work. So I have used the carotid constriction. I've been present when it was used, and it never, ever had a bad outcome. In fact, it's been something that was used in cases to prevent the need to use deadly force, to render the scene safe and actually save the life of the subject upon whom it was used. I'm aware of at least one case in which it was a very dynamic encounter, and the carotid constriction was applied, and there was movement, and the hyoid bone of the suspect was fractured, and that caused the death of this man. And but he was somebody who was very close to the point where deadly force could have been used. He had assaulted and battered several officers, and actually threw a police canine off of him, injuring the canine before that attempt was made to apply the carotid constriction. But when it's applied properly, it's not deadly. And as soon as unconsciousness is achieved, the pressure is released, the subject is handcuffed, and everybody walks away from it well. And that's every time I've used it or been present when it was used, that was the outcome. So to conflate a carotid constriction for a control or for a chokehold and take that out of the options on the force continuum increases, I believe, foreseeably the likelihood that deadly force will be used more often. So I think it's a mistake.
What would you call the maneuver applied to George Floyd?
That was a criminal murder. It was not a chokehold. It was not a carotid constriction. He applied that was nothing close to any approved law enforcement tactic. It was a absolutely improper assault and battery, causing the death of Mr. Floyd.
So that's not an official maneuver?
No, absolutely not.
And why didn't anybody else there say, like, dude, get off him?
I think that illustrates a problem, a legitimate problem. Why, especially when you consider that it's not as though he thought he was operating in a discrete place. So the arrogance that was displayed there is, as I think, as indicative of a problem in that organization as the core behavior itself. You had a crowd of people who I think were very reasonably trying to tell him to change his behavior. You also had at least one of his colleagues, who I understand had 4 days on the job, that said, "I'm not getting a pulse. We got to turn this guy over," and he was rebuffed. Well, that's a guy with 4 days on the job. So the the reality of that one is there's nothing to defend that. That would be like saying that because this officer who engaged in that conduct, committed that crime, was wearing shoes, police officers ought not be allowed to wear shoes. That had nothing to do with an approved law enforcement technique.
Did you see the press release after it?
I did not.
That almost made me as angry as seeing them kill him, is seeing that somebody wrote that up in a manner of, we brought somebody into custody, he died while taking him into custody, oops, he's dead.
I didn't see it, but I understand that. I understand it very well. And by the way, it seemed as though there was unanimity on the assessment of that course of action that took the life of Mr. Floyd. I didn't hear anybody, and it's very unusual because you had police chiefs and sheriffs across the country condemning it, and you also had members of labor organizations, the California Peace Officers Research Group, the PORAC. The labor union came out and made a statement about the impropriety of what took place there. So there is strong consensus. In fact, I'd say go so far as unanimity as to the wrongfulness of the conduct engaged in by that officer. And so that's not an area where you have to look at it and evaluate, was there a perceived level of threat? What was the threat? What was the appropriate? Were the legal requirements to justify and authorize the use of this kind of force in play? No, it's nothing close. That's why this case is such an extraordinary outlier that I think it speaks volumes. But I am intrigued by the fact that this officer had no support.
No support? What do you mean, no support?
I never heard anybody say anywhere, not his colleagues, not the law enforcement administrators, not the union people, saying that what he did was okay and he deserves a break. I have not heard that from anybody. It's been universal condemnation.
Well, I mean, they may have quickly got on the page here, but they wrote that press release, which excused the behavior and at least put out in the beginning that nothing to see here. And it wasn't until the video arrived that everybody quickly got on the same page of, oh no, I think this might have been an issue here.
And understand that this officer who did that knew full well that he was being recorded. He was wearing a body-worn camera. His colleagues were wearing body-worn cameras, and the members of the crowd, of the public that had gathered to try to change his behavior, and again, I would offer, I think very, very, very reasonably so, were actively recording what he was doing. So the arrogance that represents, I think, it speaks to an incredible problem. And there's no that case is so incredibly unique, I think, standing on its own.
Okay, I know you need to go soon, so I want to allow you to kind of summarize your thoughts here. But it seems like what I hear you saying is that George Floyd case was a huge outlier. It's incredibly crystal clear, but that most other cases, it seems like were or that Black Lives Matter is exaggerating or grasping at straws, or that the system actually does work. And I guess I wanted to challenge your notion that you think the system is mostly working and that this is an outlier and not a case of systemic racism manifesting itself in a egregious death.
I'll take it a step further. Yes, you've fairly accurately summarized my beliefs. The vast majority of law enforcement contacts end peacefully. Obviously, people get arrested. They get the citation. They don't necessarily want those things to happen, but there's not a use of force involved at all in the vastly overwhelming majority of those cases. In some cases, there's a handshake at the conclusion, and a wish for a good day or a good night, as the case may be, and everything goes just fine as it's intended to be. So the raw numbers in terms of cases that involve the use of force, certainly the use of deadly force, out of if the number that I've been told that led to believe is true is accurate, 10 million arrests on an annualized basis. That's pretty favorable in terms of the potential for something to go wrong. In my time in law enforcement, based from my perspective and the people with whom I worked closely, uh, people were not treated in a disparate manner based upon their race ever. Their behavior, yes. Their race, never. I just never ever saw it. And I think what has happened in recent years and certainly recent months, there has been an abundance of information being promulgated that says black men don't have a chance if they're stopped by the police. Well, I think that's a dishonest narrative, and it frankly puts people at a disadvantage. If I have been told my whole life that if I get stopped by the police, it's going to be a bad outcome, I'm going to be fearful too. I don't think that fear is warranted or justified. Certainly not in this region, from what I've seen and what I had a very, very good front row seat on for several decades. There is overwhelming fairness and equity, and when misconduct or bad intentions are identified, action is taken immediately.
Okay, well, we're going to have to agree to disagree on some of those points. I appreciate you spending some time talking to me and this audience, and I certainly want to make sure that I'm giving law enforcement a fair shake as we examine these issues. My cousin is in law enforcement. I have an uncle that's in law enforcement, and I have great kinship with several people in law enforcement as well. But I still think that law enforcement, John and McGinness included, is missing the big picture of what these protests and the community is telling you, and that your blinders don't allow you to see what people on the other side see, and that we need to look at not only anecdotal cases, but the system outcomes and create a better system that results in better outcomes for Black and brown people.
I think looking for ways to do business better is always a good course of action. There's always room for improvement. There certainly is not perfection. Certainly not perfection. But one other thing, and this may materialize somewhere along the line, but is it the officer's name? I believe was Chauvin in Minneapolis. I've specifically not endeavored to remember his name because I don't like him, frankly. But is it possible that he was just a jerk that would have treated anybody the manner in which he treated Mr. Floyd? In other words, I have not heard or read of any evidence of a racist motivation on his part. Some people are just inherently bad people who treat people horribly, and it has nothing to do with the race of the person with whom they have contact. In other words, Officer Chauvin may have treated me the exact same way. I don't know that to be the case, but I have heard nothing by way of utterances or emails or other communication that suggests that he was anything other than a blatant jerk and treated people poorly. And maybe he was motivated by race. But I haven't seen evidence of that yet, other than the fact that the subject, the victim of his criminal behavior, happened to be a black man.
Okay. Well, with that, we'll have to leave it at that. We see different scenarios playing out there, but I would encourage all law enforcement types to try to do more listening and try to remove our blinders as we try to seek liberty and justice in America. I think the protests, by their sheer depth and numbers, are telling you that there's a disconnect between law enforcement and those communities, and that we should listen more and figure out what's going on and how we can fix our systems. And I don't think it's people moving further away from the communities they police. And I don't think it's with bigger weapons or more militarized techniques. I think it's meeting more of the community and becoming better listeners and better communicators.
I think there's always a benefit from getting to know the people in the community. I think there are huge benefits that come from that. And that can actually be an effort that can be the product of activity on both sides. So.
Okay, John, thanks for your time.
Okay.
And
You
thanks
bet.
for everybody for listening. And this has been EverForward. I'm your host, Ed Fletcher, longtime journalist doing some independent journalism. You can find me on Twitter at NewsFletch, Ed Fletcher on Facebook, and Perpetual F on Instagram. This will air on Access Sacramento as well, and you've been watching it live here on Facebook and or Periscope. Thanks again for checking this out, and I will be back when I'm back. Thanks again. EverForward.